It's beautiful. Thank you, Rose. Don't take this wrong, but whoever was supposed to sing tonight, I'm glad they got sick. We're back in Mark's gospel tonight. We were in Matthew this morning. Mark tonight. It might be helpful to take a Bible and turn there with me. Mark chapter 9. It's been a while since I've done a message in the while we're at it format. But you know how, since those are just a series of short, unconnected thoughts, I tie them together by saying in between them, new paragraph. If you've been around here for a while, you understand how that works. Tonight, we run into what might be called a new paragraph. This moment in our text here tonight is a definite change of tune and temperature and trajectory for Jesus and for the disciples. And though I thought of several ways to sort of capture the mood of what's happening here, in the end, I decided that none of the ideas I thought of are better than the way theologian Tom Wright communicates it. It's not plagiarism if you admit it. So Wright describes setting off on a mountain hike. You know how that goes. You've been on a mountain hike? Anybody? For the first couple miles, you're usually walking through grassy meadows, where the incline, if one exists at all, is so slight you don't even realize there's an incline. You know, you don't even break a sweat. You're not aware that you're going uphill. Little by little, though, you notice how the ground changes. You know, if you look down, you see the grass is not grass anymore. It's turned to weeds and then maybe to rocks, gravel. And of course, you begin to feel the grade. You know, the further you go, there are even moments when you're tempted to stop for a little rest. Sooner or later, you realize that to one side of you, there's now a pretty steep drop-off down there. And the rock wall on your other side seems to get closer and taller. But the path is still, the path before you is still pretty flat, pretty wide. So everything still seems very stable and very safe. But then you get to a place where you round a corner. And there before you is a terrifying sight. There's a 100-foot-tall, sheer wall of rock out there in front of you. A tiny little ledge goes over to this narrow wooden ladder with a braided wire running along the side. You have to grab hold of the wire, walk across the path, and then climb up that ladder to get to the next part of the trail. And as you stop and as you stare at that for a minute, the message is clear. If you intend to go any further on this path, you're going to need a lot more courage than you have needed so far. That is exactly the mood that Mark wants us to feel here. As Jesus and Peter and James and John come down from the mountain where Jesus was transfigured, the hike of following Jesus was about to enter a new paragraph, a whole new chapter, really. So we pick up Mark 9. Let's read beginning at verse 14 there. When they, again, that's Jesus, Peter, James, and John, when they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. "What are you arguing about with them?" he asked. A man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who's possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." "You unbelieving generation, Jesus replied, "How long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground, he rolled around, foamed at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." "If you can," said Jesus, "everything is possible for one who believes." Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." When Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" And he replied, "This kind can only come out by prayer." Now, if you'll remember, before the transfiguration, before that happened, back at Caesarea Philippi, in verse 34 of chapter 8, you can look back, Jesus indicated to his disciples that there was a change coming. He told his disciples that it would soon be time for them to take up their cross. If you look at chapter 8 there, verse 34, he called the crowd to himself along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel, they'll save it." They'll save it. That's what Jesus said. It was an ominous thing to say, for sure. Did the disciples understand? Not in the least. But then you see, the path that they were walking with Jesus was still little more than a grassy field. And then up on the mountain with Moses and Elijah, Jesus' purpose was confirmed, which meant that the road ahead for Jesus and for any who would follow Jesus would certainly lead to Jerusalem, to a hard place full of hard people with whom there would have to be hard conversations and hard confrontations. And it would end in all manner of pain. Up until now, it had been comparatively easy to follow Jesus. From here on, though, the road was only going to get steeper and the path was going to get harder and rougher, beginning with this problem the disciples were having here at the foot of the mountain. While the four were away, the rest of the disciples fell into this dispute with the crowd, and some scribes, we're told, teachers of the law, over the healing of this boy. Apparently, since the disciples were unable to heal him, the scribes were probably challenging the validity of their ministry, and they got into this argument. Here was the problem. You see, before this, in days past, the disciples were able to cast out demons. They'd done all this before. But this one had them beat. And they were as confused in that moment as maybe we are about it now. They were asking the same question we're asking. Why? Why could they not do now what they had easily done before? Is it because there's different sorts of demons? Are there different ranks? Are there different abilities? Different levels of threat within demondom? Apparently so. There's something different. All Jesus says, by way of explanation, is that this sort takes prayer. And we'd presume he means a special sort of prayer, since we tend to think prayer was always a part of the process in some way or another. So here is, let me just say parenthetically, an apologetic for, a defense of intentional times of specific prayer for Christ followers. There are times when specific prayer is called for. Because not all spiritual operations, even for believers, even for Spirit-filled believers, not all spiritual operations just happen easily or effortlessly. Some obviously require more intense engagement, more focused work on our part. Now the question is, which ones are those, right? That's the question. It's tempting to answer that by saying, well, they're the ones that don't immediately work the way we expect, as was the case here. That sort of thinking, though, has led some people to conclude that God will do whatever we want if only we'll pray long and hard and maybe loudly enough, But that's not really true, is it? That's not really true. That sort of thinking reduces God to a process. It strips away his personhood. I'd suggest the better way to think about it is that God will accomplish our purposes as long as our purposes are his purposes. But just the same, his doing so still may involve quite a lot of work on our part. And as the disciples experienced here, the work involved on their part was getting noticeably harder. You see, though they weren't really aware of it, all this time they'd been walking along the mountain path with Jesus. They weren't even really breaking a sweat. The hike was amazing, even enjoyable. Seeing the remarkable sights of Jesus' miracles and being welcomed warmly in most places. There were exceptions. But generally speaking, people were very happy to see Jesus arrive in town. They were all something. Jesus and his disciples too. They were all something of local celebrities in Galilee. And the disciples were even succeeding in working miracles on their own. So this path that they'd been on all this time, it was wide and it was sure. Oh, there's a little grade here and there. But overall, it was a pretty pleasant stroll they were taking with Jesus. But here they round a corner and they abruptly realize they're going to need a whole lot more courage than they expected in order to keep going. Has that ever happened to you? Sure it has. We've heard comments about it even tonight. In your journey with Jesus, you've experienced this realization that life with Jesus seems to be getting harder instead of easier. And it seems to take us by surprise, doesn't it? Let me say neither are unusual. For some reason, Christians today often suppose that the early years of following Jesus are the hardest. And that as you go on in the Christian life, it gets more straightforward and more predictable and easier. And in some ways that is true. But with regard to the path that Jesus calls us to walk, the fact is the opposite is more often the case. It's just when we begin to learn to really walk with Jesus that he begins to give us harder tasks, which require more courage and more spiritual energy and more dependence on him, on his Spirit, which usually means more prayer, more intentionality, more communication, more effort. That is not the pop conception of Christianity in our Western society. But of course, the fact is, in our fallen world, rarely is what's popular what's good or right or true. We got to remember that. When we stop and actually reflect on what Jesus endured, and when we consider Jesus' comments about it being enough that the servant is like his master and the student like his teacher, you got to wonder, in Tom Wright's words, were we ever realistic to suppose that following Jesus would be like a summer vacation? Of course not. Of course not. And Jesus knew that. Several times already, he's tried to prepare his disciples for that reality. Even after this instance, there in verses 30 through 32, he tries again. But too often, his disciples, too often just like us, simply tune out what we would rather not hear. That doesn't change the reality, though, that the longer we serve him, the sweeter he grows, but the rougher the paths often get. In fact, the magnitude of the difference seems to even have affected Jesus a little bit. His comment there in verse 19 about the faithlessness of the people and his wondering out loud twice as to how long he'd have to be with them. I mean, we hear him say that, and that seems kind of cold to us, doesn't it? Kind of cool, unfeeling, maybe even a little insulting. But consider how disappointing and how painful it had to be to Jesus to think that even after all this investment and all this teaching, after all the miracles and the demonstrations of his power, his disciples still had so far to go. And time was getting short. Time was getting short. Have you ever tried to teach someone something and it just seems to take them forever to pick it up? You've raised kids, you understand this. If you've done that, then you understand something of what Jesus felt here. You see, up on the mountain, Jesus had taken final ownership of his destiny, and he was as ready as he could be to move forward. But down in the valley, the people he was getting ready to entrust with his mission were still powerless and beaten and baffled and helpless. It's like Moses coming down from the mountain to this disappointing scene and breaking the 10 Commandments. How frustrating that had to be for Jesus. I wonder if we ever frustrate him like that. In all honesty, I'm afraid I do. But I don't want to. I don't want to. In those moments, maybe the prayer to pray is the prayer of the boy's dad there in verse 24. Mark says, immediately the man cried out, "Lord, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." Isn't that interesting? Here again is that mixture of faith and doubt, like we talked about this morning. The boy's dad obviously witnessed the disciples' failure to heal his son, so doubts surely crept into his mind about Jesus' own ability. And that's probably why he said to Jesus in verse 22 there, kind of sort of a verbal shrug of the shoulders. Please help us if you can. And then Jesus calls his response into question. What's with this "if you can" business? Just believe it, it'll happen. And that put the dad on the spot, didn't it? Now it wasn't the disciples. It was this father who had turned a corner and saw this rock wall with the wire and the ladder. And now it was up to him to decide, okay, if I'm going to go further with Jesus, I'm going to need more courage. I'm going to need more courage to believe. And that's just what he asked for. He takes hold of the wire, he puts a foot on the ladder's first rung, and he asks Jesus for help. When we face that tall rock wall of change or difficulty or hostility in our journey with Jesus, and we will, Jesus promises we will. When we turn that corner and we see the difficulty of the trail ahead and we realize that we lack the courage to continue. Friends, we need to do the same thing. We need to take hold of the wire. We need to put a foot on the ladder's rung and then cry out to God, "I do believe, and help me in my unbelief." And we need to do it like that dad did, instantly. Mark says, immediately. See another one of Mark's, immediately. Now, you have to wonder, was this fellow's passion about the welfare of his son? Is that what drew the reaction? Maybe so. I mean, who of us isn't concerned about our children being healthy and whole? But even more important for a disciple of Jesus is our concern about Jesus' approval, about his pleasure with us, about our going where he wants us to go and doing what he has for us to do. That's what it means to love God more than parents, more than children, more than any other task or purpose that life brings. That was a requirement that Jesus said, these are my disciples. They love me more than anything or anyone else. And that's the nitty-gritty of discipleship. Doing as Jesus says to do, following Jesus wherever he leads, even when the path gets steep and when the future gets threatening. And you know, make no mistake, the path will get steep and the future will get threatening. So in those times, should our courage wane, don't back away. Instead, call out to Jesus, and he will help us. Because not only has he walked the path before us, he walks the path with us, even as we walk it. God will bring his saving project, whatever it is, to completion in our lives. We know this because he brought it to completion in Jesus. Though it took all of his resources of spiritual and physical endurance, Jesus did walk the path laid out for him by God. He held onto the wire, he climbed the ladder, he finished the journey. All the way to the summit, Jesus did. He took up his cross. And because of that, he will give us all we need to take up our cross. In his name, for his sake. As he succeeded in his part of bringing the kingdom, so will he help us succeed in the part God has for us to play. He will not leave us in the valley, unable to do even what we used to do, to be beat by life's earthly circumstances or by the prince of the power of the air. No, Jesus will give us the courage we need to go with him in finishing the task if we will only ask him. If we will ask him. And then, if we will reach out and take hold of the wire and put our foot on the ladder's first rung and start to climb. I wonder if there's anybody here tonight who has rounded a corner in your life and you find yourself facing a sheer rock wall. You know the path to it is narrow. You know it looks dangerous, and it is. The path then takes you up what looks like a pretty rickety ladder, and you realize you need more courage to follow Jesus than you have ever needed in the past. Would you want to just say to Jesus, even tonight, Jesus, I do believe, help my unbelief. You can admit that tonight. You can admit it to him. You can admit it to maybe a close friend or two, that you need more courage than you've ever needed because your path with Jesus is getting tough. You can trust him for that and keep on climbing. You can depend on him. He will take you to the top. He really will. Lord, thank you for including this moment, this event in your word. Thank you that we can count on you, that we can depend on you, that you do not call us to any place where you have never been or any place that you are not willing to go with us. And so, Lord, as we look to you tonight, if there's some here that their path seems rough and seems steep, and it seems that way because it is, Lord, let them not be discouraged. Let them not walk away in fear. But Lord, let us all reach out for the wire. Let us take hold of the ladder. Let us begin to climb, all the while trusting that you will give us the help and the courage we need to finish the hike, even when the path is difficult. We're grateful that you will do that and that we can depend on you, Jesus. In your name we pray. Amen.